When it comes to avoiding predators, one way to do it is to just keep your head down and take a licking and keep on ticking. So with plants, since they can't move around, they have to do their best. One thing we need to understand about their physiology is that these meristems, as hopefully you've gotten by now, are the important growth points for a plant. And if these are all gone, then the plant can no longer grow. So it's all right if the top of the plant gets taken off, because we can then still come back and grow a whole new branch and leaves from this point or this one. And this is how most dicots grow, but monocots grow fairly differently, as I hope you've observed. And so if you come along with a grazer or a gas-powered grazer, then you're going to take off that plant pretty low. And with the dicot over here, that's it. It's pretty much had it. Its roots can grow, but without the energy from the top, it's not going to work. Now the grass over here is taken out, but its meristem is actually down in here, and we expand it over here and look at what's going on with the grass. Until it blooms, the meristem is actually hidden way down in here, and those leaves are growing out from it. So it keeps its head down and doesn't get hurt. And that's why dandelions work as well, because when that mower comes over the top here, it takes out the grasses, but the dandelions escape and they can put out their flowers like we see here. Sometimes they just real quick peek out and bloom, set seed, before you mow the lawn the next week. So that's one way of avoiding predators or the lawnmower. So we talked about the blue bunch wheatgrass, and there's a bunch of others that can eventually, or essentially, take a licking and keep on ticking. Another strategy is to be ephemeral, and this means to have a really short life. So this, I think I took in probably March. This little plant, 2 weeks. That was his whole lifespan. So a few little leaves, send up a flowering stalk. You flower, it's already set seed, and these are gone now in May. So their whole lifespan was 2 weeks to a month, and maybe you can squeeze in enough time before all the grazers are out to actually just sneak in your whole life cycle. So that's another strategy. Then you can arm yourself. There's a lot of different ways plants have of doing this, and it may seem kind of minor, but it's at least academically interesting that you can make sharp, pointy things out of different plant parts. So spines are modified leaves, thorns are essentially short, sharp branches, and then bristles and prickles are hairs, all different structures. And then we've seen that in the stinging nettle. We find it on some gooseberries and even on the branches there. Cacti have spines, and roses we know have thorns. Well, actually they're prickles. So roses have these modified hairs that come off, and even some on their leaves. Keeps some predators away. Oregon grape has little spine-tipped teeth and really tough leaflets as well. So those are rather unpleasant to eat, and you don't often see them munched on. Seeds are another way that plants have of going. Remember, this is a whole plant, just this tiny little baby plant, just stored right there in a really tough casing that is small and can hide in the ground. So this is a way to avoid predation, but at the same time, it's also one that does attract attention because there are a lot of seed eaters out there. Since the plant has packaged all this nutrition to feed the next generation, well, that kind of sets you up for being exploited by others, saying, boy, that's a great energy source for your baby plant, but also for me. I mean, think about so many of the plants we eat. Any sort of bread, you're eating basically the baby food for the next generation of wheat or corn. So it's not a perfect system, but it works. Plants have been around a long time. The opposite approach of being an ephemeral is to be perennial and to lay down wood. This takes a lot of extra energy from the plant. So if we have the new growth up here, that's soft and supple, but if you work hard enough and you use this vascular cambium, this layer of stem cells to put on new phloem and new xylem, then you can build up layer after layer after layer of wood and actually build a pretty tall plant that gets out of the way of at least the herbivores that are the big ones and could really do some serious damage. It doesn't protect you from caterpillars and squirrels and others that are small and can climb, but at least that you're not going to get devoured by a herd of elk if you can get up above them. Plus the wood is pretty tough and inedible for most creatures, so that's another way of locking away some of your nutrients and avoiding at least a number of animals from eating you. And then the one I'll concentrate on for a while, partly just because it's an area of interest for me. I find it fascinating the way plants defend themselves. The chemical warfare aspect is probably one of the more fascinating. Mosses are a primitive, simple plant, but they taste terrible. They have a bunch of acids and tannins and lignins, all these compounds that are fairly indigestible and taste just awful. So most organisms avoid eating them. There are all kinds of different secondary chemicals, and one thing that you're probably aware of but may not think a whole lot of is these are things we seek, right? So caffeine we seek out in colas and coffee and tea. In fact, there aren't that many caffeinated plants in the world, and we seem to make a hot beverage out of just about all of them. Nicotine is incredibly stimulating, found in tobacco and some others. Curare is used as a poison, and all of these mimic an animal compound called acetylcholine. It's a neurotransmitter. Sends signals from one neuron to the next and helps us think and move and digest our food. All that sort of neurological activity is somehow co-opted by plants. So nicotine stimulates receptors in our nervous system. So no wonder it's a big stimulant. These often act as poisons. If there's too much stimulation, then we just can't control ourselves and start failing. In fact, nicotine is used very often as a poison for insects. We're just big enough that we can handle a dose of it without dying, but you could really quite easily overdose on nicotine. Another one that I mentioned just a bit ago with mosses is lignin, and that makes up glue. I mentioned it with wood as well. And so lignin glues all these cell walls together. It's really tough stuff, and it's how conifers make their compression wood. They put extra lignin sort of at the bottom to create a support for those side branches. It's a pretty complicated chemical and not one that's very digestible. In fact, it's the thing we need to get rid of in pulp when we make paper out of wood, and it's not a very useful compound. A related compound is a tannin, and you're probably fairly familiar with these. They have an astringent taste to them. If you ever had tea, especially if you over steep it, that's the sort of thing that dries out your mouth. Or if you've bitten into a piece of fruit that's not quite ripe and it feels astringent, that's tannins. And so they're these big compounds that bind up protein and protect plants from being eaten from a variety of herbivores, including insects. So it binds up the proteins and makes it kind of indigestible. In fact, we find this in a lot of unripe fruit and in oak trees, which we use for tanning leather. That's where the name comes from. A lot of uses for this to keep from being eaten. And some plants are just heavier in it than others, and some have it at just certain parts. One of the things that happens when fruit gets ripe is some of those tannins start going away. So we have a lot of uses of this. Like I said, leather tanning. So you find the skin of an animal, whether it's us or a different one, have this really thick layer of collagen underneath the thinner surface layer of the epidermis. And adding tannins, they bind to that protein and make it resistant to bacteria, along with some other important qualities. This is actually a really important part of the flavoring in some beers, but mostly wines. Some are high in tannins. A dry wine has a lot of tannins in it. It gives you that sort of astringent feeling in your mouth. And usually that comes from the oak barrels. Whiskey is another one aged in oak, and that is a very important part of the taste. In fact, I was making a batch of beer one time and added some oak chips to it. I'd boil them up, and when you smell that sort of oak tea, it smells spot on for whiskey. And so that's an important aspect of the taste. There's quite a few compounds that are called alkaloids, and they contain nitrogen in them. That's part of how you recognize them chemically, but we recognize them because they taste bitter. Our sense of taste is kind of limited compared to our sense of smell, and one of the things we're most sensitive to is bitter compounds, because they usually are detecting some sort of alkaloid, and that could be things like caffeine and nicotine, and these are probably toxins, and we don't want to eat them. So we need a warning system to say, don't swallow this. And that's our bitter taste sensors. A little bit of bitter can taste good, and in small doses is not likely to kill you, but can kill some things and certainly could harm you. We know that the deadly nightshade family, Solanaceae, is full of all kinds of toxins. And so tomato leaves have solanine, so that's why we don't eat the leaves of tomato. Green potatoes, if you've been warned, don't eat those. That's true. It has lots of solanine. It can give you a pretty upset stomach. There's a plant called ephedra. It makes it into Washington State just a little bit, I believe. And it's a bizarre plant, but it's one that makes a alkaloid compound known as ephedrine. So even in the genus name, here it is, and that's a mimic for epinephrine in people. And so it's been used in medications to open bronchioles. It's a bronchodilator, helps you breathe easier. It's been used as a weight loss compound. It essentially is simulating adrenaline in your system. That's a strange thing for a plant to do. And this could have sometimes really toxic effects in some people. And so a lot of these have been banned from the market for containing ephedra, which can be pretty dangerous. Some alkaloids we like because they're stimulating. I've mentioned caffeine a couple of times, but chocolate, and here's the chocolate pods. They call them beans sometimes, but they're really these big pods, and they take them out and ferment them to get rid of some of the super nasty alkaloids. But there's still some in there. Chocolate by itself is extraordinarily bitter. You've probably found this out if you've had unsweetened chocolate, like that powder that you bake with, the baking chocolate. So there's quite a few of these that have toxins in them. Some can't be processed by dogs, and that's why they're toxic to dogs, and you shouldn't feed your dog chocolate. I hope you haven't been. Even good old Coca-Cola gets its name from two plants that, or the main ingredients for this, the coca leaf, which we now know of as one we make and extract and make cocaine out of. And apparently there's still the extract of the coca leaf in cocaine, or in Coca-Cola. They just take the cocaine part out of it. But think about a way to get your product to market and get people addicted to it. Cocaine, pretty addictive. You got it. And then the cola part is the cola leaf, an African plant that has caffeine in it and was a stimulant and has a bit of a bitter taste to it. And we masked that with a whole bunch of sugar. It was actually originally essentially a medicinal syrup, and somebody thought about adding sugar and carbonated water, and voila, you got the beverage. There's quite a few other compounds meant to sort of gum up the mouth parts of insects, especially that might try to eat them, but others as well. So we used to get all of our rubber from rubber trees, and so you see the latex there, but we see that in milkweeds and a few others around Washington State, and all the resins given off by pine trees, even good old Douglas fir. If you tap into that thing, you're likely to get some sap. Well, what seems like sap, but that's actually the sugary part. It's the resin that comes out and gets all sticky and maybe drop on your car and give you a hard time to clean it up. So that's a defense mechanism as well. There's another group of compounds known as terpenoids, and I've talked about these a few times. They're really aromatic, so they have really strong smells a lot of times, and they're the things we think of when we think of plant aromas or essential oils, lavender oil and some others. In quite a few plants we grow for the chemistry themselves, especially all those herbs, even cannabis, right? It's terpenoid. It has interesting effects on human psychology, and it's found in these hair cells, especially on the female buds. But quite a few plants have them in these oil glands that we see just above the skin, especially anything in the mint family. This is pretty common. It's not just the mint family, but quite a few of them have these essential oils. And they do smell nice, but they don't taste very good. You wouldn't be likely to go out and just chew on a big sprig of mint. Might be refreshing, but a little shocking as well. So that's the terpenoids. They don't all taste great. Big sagebrush and all the others have lots of terpenoids that make them taste pretty bitter. So does bitterbrush. Still an important plant, but doesn't taste necessarily great. Poison ivy has some interesting oil compounds known as urushiol that are really irritating, as we well know, although most species don't seem too affected by it. It's mainly just us. And then one of the last ones I'll talk about are cyanogenic glycosides. Wow, what a mouthful. Well, you might recognize the root of this, cyano. And so this is a compound with hydrogen, carbon, and nitrogen. You can actually see it right over here. It's kind of a unique part of the chemistry of it. And this is found in the plant cells. And when they break down, they release this compound, and that is cyanide. So when hydrogen cyanide is released, that's a pretty nasty toxin. It binds to our hemoglobin and some other parts of our mitochondria to prevent oxygen from being delivered. And in large enough quantities, it's very, very toxic. And you'll find this in the wilted leaves and the fruits of those in the rose family. And if you think back, we actually have quite a few that we've talked about in the rose family. And actually, in Yakima, we grow a lot of these, right? These are some of our big crops. And for the most part, those are found in the seeds. And before you go worrying too much, you may have heard that apple seeds have cyanide in them. They do, but you'd have to eat a whole handful and chew them up to really be affected by them. So not too big of a threat, although the leaves can be, especially if they're in that wilted state where they're starting to break down. There's one staple crop that I'll just mention. It's called cassava, and it's very important staple crop, especially in Africa. And it has cyanide in it, and they have to be extensively processed to leach all that cyanide out so they can eat it. But it's really kind of essentially their main starch source because it grows well in poor soils and dry conditions. Chokecherry is one good example of a cyanide-containing plant. And so some of the leaves and fruits have that. If they're not treated properly, can affect you. Some plants produce compounds that are given off that actually call in other basically enemies of their enemies, which are their friend, right? Good Confucius saying. So if they are wounded, then they might release chemicals that attract parasites of their parasites. So Plants, really, a lot of their defenses are chemical in nature, and a lot of those have quite a bit of overlap in our medicinal chemistry as well. So for many, many years, all of our medicines came from plants, and many of them still do. And the main difference between a medicine and a poison is just a matter of dosage. So good lessons to be learned there. Let's turn to the animals now. And as we think about the predators out there that could prey on other animals, we just talked about the ones that prey on plants and how plants defend themselves. Animals, they say the best defense is a good offense. Well, I don't think most animals would agree. If you're staring down a badger or mountain lion or a wolf with these sharp teeth and claws and a lot of speed and agility, you'd really rather not go up against them. That's really your last line of defense. So the best thing to do is just avoid being seen altogether. So camouflage is a common one, a defense. And you can see the horned lizard is very well camouflaged, as are most rodents. They have that kind of brownish, grayish, like what color is that sort of fur? Well, it's kind of dirt colored so that it doesn't stand out. Now, it's not always the case with birds, and some of that's just showing off, but birds and fish can have this interesting coloration that helps to avoid being seen. So in either case, if you're looking up from underneath at them, if they're perched in a tree or swimming up in the water, the underbelly is white because the background is likely to be very light colored sky. And if you're looking down at them, if you're looking down into the water at a fish, is likely to be very dark. So the upper side is very dark, and same is true of the upper side of most birds. If they're trying to keep from being seen from above by other birds, then a dark back is probably a good idea. And, I also see stripes and spots, and all that is probably just to sort of break up their outline. A solid color or a solid body is pretty easy to spot when it moves. So usually they're not all one color. And we see that in the sage grouse as well, especially for the females. Males take more risks, and if they can survive with all that showy plumage, then they must be pretty hot stuff and can show that off to females. But females are stuck caring for the young, at least in the case of the sage grouse. So being really well camouflaged is a good idea. And snowshoe hares even take that to the next level and change their pelage once a year, or twice a year, in fact, from winter to spring, so they can change with their environment. And several organisms do that as well, including their predators. Another way to avoid being seen is to not be above ground, and so to burrow like the pocket gophers and marmots and ground squirrels and so many other small rodents that are likely to be prey. It takes a lot of energy to dig through the soil. I mean, you think it's hard to swim, try swimming through dirt. It takes a huge amount of energy, but it provides a lot of benefits for survival and avoiding predators as well. Although a few predators, like snakes and weasels, have adapted to be able to fit down these burrows as well, but you get away from a lot of them. So what about fighting back? Those bull elk and others are not to be trifled with. These wolves are standing around, and they're not just having a conference call here. They're trying to determine, is it worth trying to take this bull elk down? That's a lot of damage on those antlers, and wolves can get seriously injured or killed. Other organisms like ants, that's a real different strategy. Sting or bite or both, we know not to mess with them. So they do fight back, and getting stung is not real pleasant. Turkey vultures have an interesting defense where they vomit their extraordinarily acidic stomach contents onto potential predators. Plus, they probably smell pretty disgusting as well. I think most organisms don't make it real close to them to try to eat them anyway, but they do have that defense. So some are pretty creative. And then, you can run away or fly away if that's your option. Then that's a good one too. So all birds or most all birds are equipped with the ability to fly away, and deer are really quite impressively fast. In fact, that white tail that they fly up, you think, why would you do that? You're just advertising where you are. And apparently that, at least one hypothesis is, that's what they're trying to do. They send up that white tail and they bounce off really energetically. It's impressive to watch them. They just take these leaps and they'll jump 20 feet away. And you just look at that and say, that is really amazing. And if you're a predator, you might say, yeah, that is impressive. I don't think I can catch them. So you kind of move on to the next potential victim. You can also try fleeing by running up a tree. And so squirrels are particularly good at this, and it gets them away from a lot of different predators. Flying squirrels have the added advantage of having these big flaps on the side between their legs. They can glide from tree to tree, so they're not even just stuck up in one tree. But they're really quite agile. Many birds are this way as well, like the little nuthatch we just saw. And that's a good way of escaping your predators. And sometimes even being active at night can escape some, and that's part of the flying squirrel strategy, is to, with those big eyes, wander around at night instead of during the daytime when you're more obvious like most squirrels. But then a lot of predators adapt, and they start hunting at night as well, and that's the owl's specialty. And at least the northern spotted owl, that's its main prey, is that northern flying squirrel. And so not always the greatest strategy to try to escape your predators by just being active at night. But this is kind of an arms race. The owl has some pretty remarkable adaptations for seeing at night, flying silently, being agile, flying through the forest. This is not an easy task, and they don't hit their mark every single time. So being a predator is not necessarily easy work. But again, neither is escaping them. I'll end with this story about a case in Hawaii. And in Hawaii, they have quite a few invasive species. Islands are kind of prone to this. And one was the rat. And it was brought over on ships, escaped, probably not even on purpose. And so it really became a real nuisance and a problem. So people brought in a mongoose. This is kind of the classic, I know an old lady who swallowed a fly. And then you kind of swallow something else to catch the problem. Well, the problem in this case was it didn't work, and really backfired, and kind of illustrates how little we know sometimes about how plants and animals operate. Well, the mongoose is active during the day, and that's something that we can't really change about it. That's how it's hardwired. And the rats are active at night. And so this wasn't a case that really worked out. So the mongoose, although would be very happy to eat rats, it ate what was easiest. And in many cases, that turned out to be the extensive bird population, including the nene, the national bird or state bird of Hawaii, which is now endangered. Although I understand improving, but that was one of the problems, is these guys had taken to eat their eggs. So many of the prey species employ multiple strategies to avoid getting eaten. Usually just one is not enough.